But with this new global economy, we face the problem of making sure that its benefits do not just create a new richer class and a much poorer, more desperate class. Rather, we must find a way to have a more equitable distribution of wealth that being a global city naturally brings.
Well, welcome to the Society of Midland Authors. My name is Robert Lowenzel, and I am the Society's president. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Chicago Public Radio for recording our event for their online program, Chicago Amplified. The audio from this event will be posted at wbez.org/amplified, where you can find all of our events. And CAN TV is also here tonight recording, so this will be on cable TV sometime soon. And I'd like to remind you all that while there is no admission charge for tonight's event, we gladly accept donations to defray our costs for using this beautiful space here at the Cliff Dwellers Club. If you haven't already, please feel free to drop a few dollars over there on the piano where the collection mug is. You may have heard also in the news this past week that the Cliff Dwellers has lost its lease and will be moving out of this space at the end of March. The Society will continue to hold our programs here until then, and we'll let you know as soon as we can about the location for our future events and the future home of the Cliff Dwellers Club. Our speakers tonight are Don Rose, Dick Simpson, and Constance Mixon. Dick and Constance are the editors of a new book called 21st Century Chicago, and Don is one of the book's contributors. Dick Simpson is a former Chicago alderman and the head of the political science department at the University of Illinois Chicago, and he's written a number of books, including one of the definitive books about the history of the Chicago City Council with the apt title Rogues, Rebels, and Rubber Stamps. Constance is an associate professor of political science and the director of the Urban Studies program at Elmhurst College. And if you follow Chicago politics at all, you will probably recognize Don Rose's name. He's an independent political consultant, and he's often quoted in the media and writing essays and op-ed pieces about what's happening in Chicago's political scene. So here we are about a year after our new mayor, Rahm Emanuel, has taken office. It does seem like an incredible new age just to think that Chicago has a mayor other than someone named Richard Daley. And so we're all curious to hear what you have to say about where Chicago stands today and what its future is going to be. Would you like to start off, Dick?
Yeah, and would you pass those out, Robert?
We have flyers here describing the book with the list of contributors and information on how to get a copy, and I will pass those out as our speakers begin.
So Connie and I are going to try and go through what is a long 250-page book very quickly and just hit some highlights and do it in a more formal way, and then we'll be glad to answer questions. Don is going to cover both his article and what's going on in Chicago today. So let's begin. Chicago was born over 150 years ago. We're now the third largest city in the United States with a population of just under 3 million people in a metropolitan region of 9.5. We live in a metropolitan region, and metropolitan Chicago is larger in population and has greater wealth than most nations in the world. Here in Chicago, we live in a time of challenge and change. During the last several decades, we have been transformed into a global city, while at the same time, population, jobs, and housing stock have declined. We're currently enduring the Great Recession, under which we are suffering job losses and government cutbacks.
Mayor Rahm Emanuel, in his February 2011 victory speech, said, "The real work of building a better future begins tonight. We have not won anything until a kid can go to school thinking of their studies and not their safety, or until the parent of that child is thinking about their work and not where they're going to find work. We said it's time for tough choices because denial in the face of challenge is no strategy for success. But we also told Chicagoans that our fate, our future, is in our hands. If, as Mayor Emanuel said, our fate and our future is in our hands, then what are we to do? In our book, we consider 4 big choices: social, economic, political, and governmental change.
The major economic change in Chicago metropolitan region over the last 4 decades has been the loss of manufacturing and manufacturing jobs, and the switch first to our service and then to our global economy. But with this new global economy, we face the problem of making sure that its benefits do not just create a new richer class and a much poorer, more desperate class. Rather, we must find a way to have a more equitable distribution of wealth that being a global city naturally brings. In short, we are struggling to become a global city that is both livable and humane, one in which wealth and prosperity are shared. Chicago has become an influential hub of business and culture, sports, and international policy debate. And we have become again a city of immigrants.
In our ever-expanding metropolitan region, our main social problem is the connection between race and poverty. Metropolitan Chicago remains one of the most segregated regions in North America. It has a segregation index of about 82%. This means that for each Chicago neighborhood and suburb to have a racial mix equal to the metropolitan region as a whole, 82% of us would have to move. We live in segregated neighborhoods in a very segregated metropolitan region. Former 5th Ward Alderman Leon Dupre, who recently died, is quoted in our book. He said, "I rejoice that Chicago has come as far as it has in regard to race. But people are still imprisoned by racial segregation in this city. Often, as in the past, it is an imprisonment based on where they are forced to live. In neighborhoods where there are no jobs, few opportunities, no good schools, no health facilities, no stores, no decent housing, no personal safety, and limited public transportation."
Our city of Chicago is now about 33% black, 34% white, 27% Latino, and 6% Asian and others. Whites are no longer the majority. And while we almost weren't looking, we have become a multiracial, multicultural city. Latinos are the fastest growing part of our population, and this is true in the suburbs as well as in the city. Yet they have not received their fair share of power, and this has set up a power struggle of the remap of Chicago wards. But being again a city in a metropolitan region of immigrants means that we have advantages as a global city. Our people speak every language on the planet. They do business easily in every country in the world. And at the same time, there are vast physical changes occurring in Chicago as well. There is always in a city a tearing down to build up. There is in our book a very poignant story told by Florence Scala to Studs Terkel about urban renewal just west of the Loop when the University of Illinois at Chicago was being built. This is Florence Scala. "You know, there's a very real kind of ugliness among nice people. You know, the dirty stuff that you think only the hoodlums pull off? They can really destroy you, the nice people. I sometimes want to defend even the gangsters. They don't pretend to be anything but what they are. You can see what they are. They aren't fooling anybody, see? But the nice people fool you. We were dispensable. Our alderman, he's not what I would call a good man. Even he tried to convince the mayor that this mass displacement was wrong. But the mayor was hearing other voices, the nice people."
In 21st century Chicago, we focus on the political transformations that are occurring within the Chicago metropolitan region. Political machines have governed the city since the Chicago fire. In 1931, Anton Cermak created a single democratic machine, which was perfected by Mayor Richard J. Daley. This machine was partially transformed under Richard M. Daley. With the election of Mayor Rahm Emanuel Cook County Board President Tony Prewinkle, several new aldermen and county commissioners last year, we are now at a point of deciding whether machine politics will continue, change again, or be discarded. A lot of political reforms over the past 40 years have come by court cases and lawsuits, as recounted by Don Rose in his article in our book. The Chapman cases have undercut patronage, and the Sorich trial has made patronage a criminal offense. Northside lawyer Bernie Weisberg sued Paul Powell to end rigged elections. Racial gerrymandering has been partially curbed by lawsuits filed by Judson Minor. And police spying on political groups was ended by an ACLU lawsuit. And residential segregation in public housing was ended by the famous Gautreaux cases. But political reform will not be complete until we, the voters, and the officials that we elect replace the political machine with a better politics for the 21st century. The governing structures in the Chicago metropolitan region remain antiquated and misaligned for any meaningful reform of regional governance. Chicago and Cook County governments and the governments throughout our entire metropolitan region are characterized by fragmentation. They are basically a 19th century set of governments that are trying to cope with 21st century problems. In Cook County alone, there are 540 separate units of government with the power to tax, and there are 1,200 in the 6-county metropolitan region. Today's plethora of governments continues to inhibit accountability, effectiveness, efficiency, and coordination.
And all of our governments, of course, have run out of money. The state has a $5 to $8 billion structural deficit. The city had to close a $650 million budget gap, and the county $300 million in Chicago this last budget. Schools, the CTA, and suburban governments are mostly in the same boat. So we will have to raise taxes and cut government jobs and services, which is always painful. Mayor Emanuel's budget, for instance, closed police stations, reduced library hours, raised the water fees $140 million, along with $180 million in higher property tax for the public schools. And within Chicago city government, the legislative branch, the Chicago City Council, has remained a rubber stamp, although there have been sparks of independence in the last few years. The county board had more independence under the previous board president, Todd Stroger, with whom they fought, but neither the city council nor the county board has yet to become a genuine legislative body capable of helping to guide our recovery and transformation. Most unfortunately, we still have a continuing culture of corruption. More than 1,500 public officials have been convicted of public corruption in Chicago and Cook County since 1970. And for every one of those that's convicted, there are a dozen more people who narrowly escape the judicial system. 31 current and former Chicago aldermen have been convicted of public corruption in this same time period. In fact, City Hall and the council chambers are the worst crime area in the city of Chicago, much worse than any ghetto that we have. And the estimated cost of corruption, or the corruption tax, is at least $500 million a year.
As Mayor Emanuel challenged us to do, we must choose our future. For us to have a more positive future in the new global economy and changing society, we must adopt a vision of a new Chicago. We must end machine politics, reform our governments, rebuild our economy, and end racial segregation. We must promote new businesses, welcome folks of other races and cultures to live in our neighborhoods, support aldermen and other local officials, but also hold them accountable. We must join and lead neighborhood organizations and civic associations that are working to transform our neighborhoods and our city. In our book, we include President Barack Obama's 2009 speech on metropolitan policy. In that speech, Obama quoted Daniel Burnham's famous "make no little plans" line. Obama then went on to say, and that's the spirit behind Burnham's bold and ambitious designs unveiled 100 years ago that helped transform Chicago into a world-class city. That's the same spirit which we have to approach the reinvention of all America's cities and metropolitan areas. A vision of vibrant, sustainable places that provide our children with every chance to learn and to grow, and that allow our businesses and workers the best opportunity to innovate and succeed, and that let our older Americans live out their best years in the midst of all that metropolitan life can offer. Now is the time to seize that moment of possibility, and I am absolutely confident that starting today with this conversation, you and I together, we are going to be able to make this happen.
Now we'll turn to Don Rose, who will talk both about what he put in the book, but also what's happening currently in Chicago.
Thank you. The main point that I was making in my chapter, as Connie alluded, was that we had some very significant reforms take place over the last 30 or 40 years. Unfortunately, these reforms were not initiated by civic leadership, nor ratified by any legislative body for the most part, since reform meant changing their ways. I was responsible, by the way, for electing the only two mayors of the last half century who weren't named Daley. People often asked about Richard Daley in this Richard Daley the Elder in this very, very segregated city where the actual segregation ratio was then in the low 90s, 92 or 93. We were the most we were the most segregated city in America. And the black community, which stretched from the far south end of the city to the center and then up west in this vast L shape, was the largest contiguous population, 90% or more black, outside of Africa. And this didn't happen accidentally. This was enabled and sustained and generated to a very large extent by the actions of governmental bodies under Richard J. Daley. Richard M. Daley was able to inherit, to an extent, a somewhat desegregated and a somewhat reformed city. But when we look at what happened, the CHA, for example, really, no pun intended, set in concrete a totally residentially segregated city. The school system was intentionally segregated. There was a school guy, a school chief, superintendent. You may remember the name Ben Willis. And it still gives me the willies when I think that we now have a Willis Tower replacing Sears Tower. The school system, the police department, the park system, each and every aspect, governmental entity, was over the years found guilty of racially segregating and violating either the Constitution or the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it took these very courageous lawsuits, class action suits and so on. Some of them made a tremendous difference, as Mike Schechtman's patronage decision did. The CHA, unfortunately, we were able to desegregate a very tiny portion of the city and open up some portions of the suburbs, thanks to the Gautreaux Act, which was the Gautreaux decision, I should say, which was originally an ACLU suit and is now most widely recognized as the product of Alexander Polikoff, of business and professional people in the public interest. It took courts to do it because our legislative bodies wouldn't do it, and our executives didn't want to do it. They were busy taking care of themselves. The ward remap, we're going now through another phase of ward remapping where we have competition not as much between whites and blacks as we had in the older suits, which were finally decided on behalf of the African American population. But we now have maps that are reflecting the conflict between African Americans and Hispanics, or Latinos. It's a very, very complex and frustrating matter. If you look at the way some of these wards are being drawn and replaced, everybody is trying to make everybody else happy. We have legal problems to live up with in making each ward the same size. Try to make them within 1% of each other, and the best they can do now is some of the wards vary by as much as 5 and 6%, which in itself may be a violation of Baker-Carr, the so-called, we called it one man, one vote, now we call it one person, one vote decision of 1962. So these struggles continue, and we have, under our new mayor, many new struggles we still have to go through. We talked about the debt here, what is it, 650 million, which we've only scratched the surface or around the edges been able to reduce that deficit. Dick talks about raising taxes. It's a fat chance that any legislative body or executive is going to ask you to raise taxes. Good old Pat Quinn, the only incompetent as he may be, the only honest guy, said we got to raise taxes, and indeed he raised them and scared the pants off of everybody. I wish he had the executive competence that he has, integrity of concept. We're still faced with many, many problems. One of the ways, the main way that our current mayor, and in fact our previous mayor, thought of reducing the deficit that made any sense was a casino, which induces its own problems. I suspect we're going to have a casino. We could reduce our entire deficit if we were to introduce something like a financial transactions tax, which may happen internationally and possibly even nationally before it happens in Chicago. This would be a tax that would affect, remember this, the phrase we're using now, the 1% financial transaction tax would probably affect 1/2 of the 1% and still yield enough money to wipe out the local deficit as well as the national deficit. But even allegedly liberal administrations, such as we have in Washington, are still scared of Wall Street, and it's unlikely to happen. As I say, it's more likely to happen overseas, where the financial transactions tax will probably be the salvation of Western Europe and the euro problem we've heard so much about. What are the remaining problems in Chicago? Well, we have some of the worst poverty in the country in 3 or 4 neighborhoods. You always read about Inglewood and a few others. And those are also infested with crime. This administration has paid a little bit, the city administration has paid very little attention to the question of poverty because they don't have an answer to it. Unfortunately, in reducing the budget, they're thinking the wrong way. In Emmanuel's budget trimmings average 2 and 3% for most administrative units of the city. 7% for social services. The police should be redeployed into those very impoverished pockets of poverty, which are hotbeds of crime. But Emmanuel is opposed to redeploying the entire police department. Instead, he goes through a little routine where they take the tactical unit and spread them out over the city, allegedly putting more cops on the street, but not really focusing on the high crime areas. And we've heard nothing yet about community policing, which is probably the only way that we can do, we can hit crime in those areas where people are as afraid of the police as they are of the crooks. We read these articles about how nobody's going to talk on the street about what's going on. Everybody knows who the bad guys are, but nobody talks about them. Well, we look back at the police department and everybody knows who the bad cops are, but they don't admit that. So until the police omerta ends, you can hardly expect the neighborhoods to welcome investigations and open up to what they know. I could go on and on any of these subjects, including misdirection in the schools, where so-called school reform means teaching to the test, which never ain't educated anybody. I have a whole long lecture on that subject, and I want to keep my companions here awake, but I did want to mention that. What else do we have to look at as far as new lawsuits? One area has finally come to light. If any of you read the New York Times, if you saw the Chicago section last Friday and Sunday, I'm proud to say some articles that I helped generate where they examined the question of public officials who also work as lobbyists. You can be a mayor, a state legislator, an alderman, and still make loads of money as a lobbyist as long as you're not lobbying your own body. However, you get silly things going on, such as the president of the Senate representing a hospital firm that wants to build a hospital, goes out to a suburban mayor, and he's allowed to lobby the suburban mayor, and imagine the pressure on this poor mayor who knows that one day, maybe very soon, he's going to have to come to the Senate for some legislation to help his town. Our current assessor, Joe Barrios, was also on the Board of Tax Appeals, which decides whether or not you get your tax break. And Joe Barrios was also lobbying for the people who were going to put video poker in every bar. Imagine the guy comes to lobby you on behalf of video poker, and this is the same guy you may have to come back to have your taxes, your tax appeal changed. Well, Barrios says he doesn't have to do that anymore now that he's got the job of assessor, so some of his family still does it. Some bright, brilliant young lawyer in the line of Mike Shackman, who took on the whole patronage system and won, has to go after this one form of legal corruption, legitimately. Who's the fellow from New York about Tammany Hall? I forget. Mr. Somebody used to talk about
George Washington Plunkett, who
Plunkett.
talked about honest graft.
Mr. Plunkett, honest graft and dishonest graft. What I'm talking about here is, at the present, honest graft, and we've got to eliminate, or certainly attempt to criminalize as best we can that kind of corruption, which adds to our debt, as Dick points out, the $500 million a year corruption tax. I think we have to look very carefully at our criminal justice system, which is still, what should one say, treats the poor unfairly at best. Time after time, you've read, fortunately, we have a couple of innocence projects and groups out of Northwestern that have released people from jail, wrongly accused for years and years and years, and finally they're broken. They're released due to the intense work of some of these other bright young lawyers. This is not. It's unfortunately, this is a case-by-case basis rather than a class action that can be undertaken in the way that the Shackman case and some of the other major cases were. We have to look at the question of privatization. Need I mention parking meters and all the mistakes that were made there? There are a couple of lawyers working on that issue. So-called TIFs, tax increment financing, which is a reverse Robin Hood in most cases. It's supposed to help blighted areas come back, and rather than help blighted areas come back, our TIF program, for the most part, is a reverse Robin Hood, robbing the poor and giving to the rich. I'm waiting for that. I'm also waiting for another broader suit on the issue of gerrymandering. This is something that could go across the whole country, which not just that we're guilty of it, but political gerrymandering robs all of us for the sake of the parties in power. And we have to go beyond. We won the battle of racial gerrymandering. I think we have to go to political gerrymandering and creating greater equity on a national basis. But you've got to start somewhere. California is trying to start. Texas is going the other way, as it usually does. Illinois could join California if we wanted to show a little bit of guts and integrity. Maybe that's asking too much. Well, I think I've outlined a few issues. I just want to close with the very current issue, and that is Mayor Emanuel's proposed ordinances to suppress dissent at the forthcoming G8 and NATO meetings here. It looks more like he's going back to the days of Richard J. Daley by not just by seeking some very repressive measures that are ostensibly aimed at keeping the peace. But let me tell you about some of the measures. They would shorten the time of marches or demonstrations. They would force the organizers of demonstrations to provide and marches to provide one marshal for every 100 persons. They would limit the amount of the decibels that would be created. And every group would have to register well in advance in order to qualify for protest. These all sound very reasonable, except for the fact that thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of people will be coming here from all over the world. Nobody is in charge of them. Nobody is in control of them. Those who are seeking parade permits are a very small organization trying to put some rationality to the protest. And what he's doing with these proposed ordinances is, in effect, building in failure. We're going to wind up putting everybody at risk because the organizers have no idea how many people are coming, that they can provide a marshal for every 100 persons. They have no idea how many bullhorns or trumpets or brass bands people are going to bring to raise those decibels. They don't know how long people are going to want to speak or how long a march is going to take to go from the Civic Center to McCormick Place. We will almost automatically put everyone at risk of breaking the law. And they call this protecting the First Amendment. These ordinances are coming up on the 18th, and I would suggest if any of you are in touch with your, I'm sorry?
It's 18th, that's right.
The 18th, yeah. If you're in touch with your local alderman, you might express something about this. You can read in greater detail a larger essay I've just published on this subject in my column in the Chicago Daily Observer. If you go to cdobs.com, that's for the Chicago Daily Observer, you can hear all this put in a more coherent fashion than winging it right here in front of you all. Well, I think we've thrown enough meat out there, so you folks chew on it a while and get to bed.
I want to make just one more introduction before we go to questions. Missy Zamuda is here. Missy, would you wave your hand? She is almost a co-editor. She did an enormous amount of work, particularly the technical work on the book. And if any of you have done books, you'll know how enormous that task is. We're glad to take your questions. We did mention a couple of topics along the way and maybe said a few controversial things. So I suspect we'll have a spirited discussion. And whichever one of us you want to answer will be fine, or we'll fight it out among ourselves who gets to answer each good question.
One question.
Let me start with Marty, and then I'll come across to you, Leo.
Professor Simpson and Professor Mixon, you mentioned Mayor Emanuel's inauguration speech and the loss of manufacturing jobs. So far, has he managed to lure more jobs in Chicago than people he's laid off? And what's the future possibility of Chicago garnering more jobs?
I'll take a quick hit at it. We don't have an accurate count. He puts out a count each week when he signs another company that holds a press conference, but we don't really know. We have been losing manufacturing jobs, we know, up until the time he took office. To the best of my knowledge, there's no accurate count. We lost, in the period from 1970 to 1985, 250,000 manufacturing jobs, 250,000 of them. Currently, the unemployment rate runs from 10 to 15% officially, but in many of the ghettos, the unemployment rate, for instance, for young black men in some of the neighborhoods Don was talking about, are more than 50%.
I think one of the articles in our book actually addresses that, entitled Building Human Capital, from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in which they specifically focus on the educational system within Chicago, that we have to build our own human capital. And one of the areas that I'm really interested in is our community college system, and the ability of our community college system to be able to prepare and train workers for this global economy. And unfortunately, the system as it currently exists is not well prepared to do that.
Leah, you had a question?
Yeah. This is kind of a vague global question. People are not unaware of the corruption in Chicago. They really know on some level that things are not altogether kosher, that the judges can be really corrupt, that the police department can be really corrupt. Just name it, it's corrupt. Where is, in general, the outrage? Why is it that people are sitting here going about their business? I go to the CSO. I can't believe people are not more furious than they are.
Well, I can't answer why they're not more furious. After each major conviction or indictment, like the Blagojevich conviction, we get some minor steps forward. The Governor's Commission on Ethics issued 20 proposals. They were able to get the first new campaign finance laws passed, however weak they were. And I expect to see some more with the current sentencing of Blagojevich. But the problem is there's no one silver bullet. The Reform Commission and the work Tom Gradle and I have done list about 20 different steps that need to be taken. I'll just give one example that's never mentioned. We have to change education in the public school system so we teach the cost of corruption and civics. They've cut civics and social science out of the curriculum. There is no more. Well, it's a matter of whether we want to force that. That is an issue on which we could win. You have to reverse a culture of corruption. Our estimate is it'll take 2 decades, and there is a roadmap. The 3 roadmaps that exist are the Governor's Commission, Pat Quinn's book on the topic, which lists 4 major topics and then a series of small steps, and the work that's on my Chicago Politics website. And they all detail what needs to be done. What we don't have is an agreed common agenda which we're all behind, saying, okay, these are the things that we're willing to work for. I think the public can easily be convinced. It's a little hard for the public to figure out what 20 things need to be done, but it's that work has, I think, been done. It's just getting agreement and momentum. Anybody else?
This question always comes up from, usually from the outside. Why do we tolerate this level of corruption in Chicago? And the best answer I can give anybody is if we look back where the city came from, we went through a reform many, many, many years ago, back in the 20s, when we booted Al Capone, who was running the city, out to Cicero, and we traded him for a political machine, which was, in fact, less corrupt than Al Capone. I mean, the political machine hardly kills anybody unless it's absolutely necessary. And so our history is such. I compare it to my house. I have a couple of cats, and I have a cat box on the way in the back porch. And I think my cat box doesn't smell much because I live with it for a long time, and every so often somebody new walks in the door and says, your cat box needs changing. I didn't notice it, but that's where the outrage is. We've been living with that stinking cat box for so long, we're almost inured to the smell.
Just going down the road.
This is sort of building on the same theme here, but historically, both in Chicago and Illinois generally, we've had few, if any, restraints on campaign finances. And now, at the national level, thanks to the Supreme Court, we've got the Citizens United decision that's opened the spigots miles wide in terms of the kind of money that can be put into campaigns all over the country. And I want to preface your responses by mentioning a stark contrast. Back about 30 years ago, Don here was gracious enough to pay a visit out to Iowa City when I was a young city council candidate. The rules were, by city ordinance out there, $50 was what you could donate to one candidate in one election cycle. Nobody, since I came to Chicago, can believe when I tell them that that was the limit. They think I'm kidding. That stuff can be done in a different political culture. But I would like to hear some comment on this sort of Illinoisification of national campaign finance limits. We're exporting our corruption to the nation here.
Well, let me also point out one thing that's actually going on right now. There is testified before the State Commission on Campaign Finance, which is looking into the problems created by the first law that was done after the Blagojevich indictment. And the one thing that's pretty clear is we are on the brink of being able to at least publicly finance judicial campaigns. It is absolutely outrageous that lawyers give money to judges who then appear before the judges. And yes, the judge is not supposed to know that my good friend Don gave me $5,000. I will never know because I'm a judicial candidate and I'm not allowed to know, but somehow that domestically does come true. That's actually, the report is going to the governor and then to the state legislature in the next couple of weeks. Trying out public financing works in multiple places. Maine, it works even in New Jersey to some extent. It works out in New Mexico. it would work in Illinois, and this is a chance to at least take a first step beyond that. The other big item that didn't get passed in the campaign finance law is the political party leaders can still give enormous sums of money to the candidates and make them beholden, which is why the four tops are so strong. I don't know where we get the votes to pass that, but I do think we could get public financing for judicial campaigns. I think that is a practical next step. Doesn't answer all your other question about the Illinoisification of the nation, and certainly Citizens United is a terrible decision, and we're going to have to get congressional legislation to overturn it, I think. Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman here.
Is the reason that our city administrations have been cutting aid to the poor and putting restrictions on demonstrators and hostile to unions is because they've been socializing with corporate contributors that mostly support conservative Republican candidates, like in Wisconsin.
You want to start with that one?
Well, it's part of the same game that's been going on for such a very, very long time. Both parties are very, very much indebted to Wall Street, and I think the only thing that could possibly start to make a change has to go way up the top, all the way to the Supreme Court, and pick up a new majority in the Supreme Court, which may be very, very difficult to do given the present makeup and given the timidity that we see in even this wonderful liberal administration, which will be running its own billion-dollar campaign, as we well know.
Well, go to the other side for a while, yes.
Thanks. Thank you for speaking today. How does the average citizen evaluate these different redistricting schemes and make a decision or determination one way or the other?
They're all available on different internet sites now. There are three maps, roughly the Black Latino and the Latino MALDEF map. In addition, aldermen that are particularly affected, like the 43rd Ward alderman and the 2nd Ward alderman, have been sending their constituents at least the maps as to how it would affect their community and why they've chosen one side or another. The big problem, and there are two hearings. One is tomorrow night, I'm doing this from memory, so check me on it, at DePaul University, and the other is on the far south side on Thursday night. There's supposed to be two more public hearings up in the air somewhere in the world. They're supposed to exist. They haven't been announced yet, but there will be a total of 4 public hearings. Now, it may well be that going to public hearings is not going to affect the outcome. I have sometimes seen such things where they don't. But putting pressure on the members of the City Council, once you can figure out the differences in the maps, and we could talk a little bit about some specifics, but that's probably too detailed since everybody comes from a different ward. But getting in, you have to be informed, you have to act quickly because the vote's the 18th.
My wife and I live in a high-rise in Dearborn and Elm. We have a lot of Section 8 people, we all get along. We're well integrated. What's the percentage of high-rise in Chicago that also have Section 8 people?
I didn't
Well, the question is, what's the percentage of high-rises? Let me first of all explain a few things. Section 8 is the public housing subsidy granted by CHA to low-income people to live in private property. There may be, 10,000 Section 8 people. There are quite a few. There's a longer waiting list wanting them than have them. The percentage of high-rises and some new buildings now have the requirement that they at least have to have affordable housing and may have public housing as a condition for getting their particular zoning, so we're beginning to slowly expand. But roughly speaking, if I were going to make a guess, 2% of the high-rises in Chicago, or 3% or something, have Section 8 as part of them. That's a fairly new program for high-rises. Section 8 can also be used in the suburbs, and you can also count the number of suburbs almost on one hand that allow Section 8 housing in their neighborhoods. suburbs are often much more segregated than the city. I mean, if you go out to Harvey and Markham, they're all black. There's probably not a white person who lives in the town. You go up to Winnetka, our data there is just like 1 or 2% black. Kenilworth, all of the northern suburbs. The only people that live there are Mr. T and the servants that are African American. And poverty rates are very hard to tell. One surprising thing about poverty rates, which I'll give to Connie to talk about, is poverty is much more widespread in the suburbs than is usually known.
Yeah, just adding to that, and one of the things that we look at specifically in our book is dealing with the metropolitan region as a whole. If we're going to be able to compete in the global economy, we can no longer think of city versus suburb anymore. And a lot of the Section 8 now choice vouchers have been dispersed, and a lot of them have moved into the suburbs. And we have an article in the book by Barbara Rose that talks specifically about poverty in DuPage County, which is where my college, Elmhurst College, is located. And 1 of every 20 people in DuPage County is at the poverty line, and 1 out of every 5 households in DuPage County has an annual income below $35,000. And that's kind of different than what we think of in terms of DuPage County. DuPage County is often considered one of the most wealthiest counties in the entire state, if not the whole entire country. But poverty is increasing, and it's shifting to the suburbs, which are ill-prepared, really, to deal with the increasing poverty. And don't quote me on this, but if I'm remembering the exact number of vouchers, there were only like 4,000 vouchers that were dispersed in all of DuPage County, but you have thousands more that are living at the poverty line, and they're unable to afford to be able to live in that county. And that's also where there's been the largest job growth. When you look at the metropolitan region as a whole, jobs are increasing in DuPage County, but there's very, very little affordable housing for the people that want those jobs. So you end up with a whole bunch of other problems with commuting, and I'll pass it on to Don.
Yeah, I want to make a point. Section 8 basically is dead. There were 2 Section 8 programs that did provide housing for impoverished people. One is the voucher program, where individuals could go out and perhaps get a voucher, and with that voucher move into some buildings, existing buildings that would agree to take in Section 8 tenants, say up to 3%, 10%, 5%. The other Section 8 program, which was building new housing, such as, if you're talking about Dearborn and Elm Street Plaza, as they call it, where the Treasure Island Market is, was a building that was built from scratch with funding from the Illinois Housing Development Authority under the agreement that it would devote 20% of its units to, in effect, public housing level incomes through poverty cases, and the idea being that if you integrate poor people into into a larger middle income grouping, that people will learn to get along. Now, there are not very many buildings that were built that way. Probably, in the white areas where you can actually integrate economically and racially, there are probably not more than 15 or 20 such buildings. The rest of them are cutting deals using the vouchers, but those vouchers are diminishing and they're being spread out all over. But new construction, Section 8 is dead. The program's gone.
In the very far back.
Hi, thanks. 2 big questions. One is, where is talking about the redistricting, where is today's loyal opposition to the IPI, IPO? And then the second question I have is a little meta. Why this book? What's the genesis? Why this book? Why this form? Why now? What do you want us to learn from it?
Okay, I'll let Connie start on the book part. I'll answer very quickly the first part. I wish I knew where the loyal opposition in the city council was.
Right.
We do track the roll call votes of the city council members, we haven't looked recently, but when we looked as of the end of November, there were only 4 votes total out of all the legislation that's been introduced since the council took office in May, in which a single alderman voted against any mayoral program or voted against anybody else's proposal, but they've all been mayor proposals. If you ask the alderman, they'll say, well, everything's been pretty good, so there hasn't been anything to object to. We haven't looked at the final budget vote yet. There were a few no votes in the budget. We're hoping we can't even do our normal analysis of the city council unless there are 10 sets of votes or so in which people might have voted in opposition, because we can't, the percentage would be too skewed. You know, one person voted once against it, but there are only 4 divided roll, there are even fewer. I think there are 2 divided roll call votes so far in November. So they're voting 50% of the time with the mayor on divided roll call votes. That isn't helpful information. So we're looking for that. I thought the budget would cause divided roll call votes. I can pretty well guarantee the remap will cause divided roll call votes. Whatever the first big divided roll call, and if the budget didn't, if the remap does, from our experience in studying city councils for 150 years in sections, but particularly intensively for the last several decades, the first key division, and it may well be the remap, sets the pattern for the votes for the rest of the 4-year period usually. So it could be a very important division that becomes permanent in the council. So we, like you, are anxious to see, we're really anxious for the city council to take on a life of its own and offer some real solutions instead of just voting 99.99% with the mayor. I'm going to let Connie quickly talk about the genesis of the book and how it came about, and we'll be glad to, some of you are authors and the rest and might be interested in some of the mechanics. This is different from most of the books people write, and we'd be glad to talk about how do you get a contract for this kind of book, and what are the mechanics if people are interested.
Well, I think Dick and I both shared a common goal of creating a better future for the Chicago metropolitan region. And within the book, we address 4 major areas: social, economic, political, and governmental changes that are necessary to have a better future. And we're both teachers, we're both professors, and we've been teaching urban politics for years. And while there's a lot of urban politics books out there, there were none that were really accessible at the undergraduate level that dealt specifically with Chicago. There were some for graduate students, but that would be easily accessible for undergraduates, specifically dealing with Chicago politics. We're a very political city. It's a great place to study urban politics within the Chicago metropolitan region. And thus we felt that this book was an important contribution to the existing literature and really filled a void that existed within the urban politics literature and the Chicago literature. And much more than your typical textbook, it contains newspaper articles, governmental reports, speeches, things that are interesting, that aren't as dry as normal textbooks. And not only is it accessible to undergraduate students, I think that it has broader applications and that it's accessible to the public in general that is interested in a little bit of the history and helping to create a better future for the city of Chicago.
Just 2 additional points. We do think it's useful for others. I think my university is going to give copies to each of the consulate generals in Chicago. There are more than 50 consulate generals, and when they come here, what do they know about Chicago if they're coming representing Great Britain or Chile, or they're representing the Czech Republic? So we think that would be useful. We think for new CEOs or business people who are coming that need some primer about what's this Chicago place, not what was it 50 years ago if they read Boss, but what's it like today and what carries through. We also think public officials should read it. We do think they can read, and we think they should. They need a background, and the same for community organizers, civic leaders, people who want to provide leadership. You have to know the past and something of the current crises and the directions that we're going to be able to provide guidance for the future, we think. Any last questions? Yeah, Robert. There are actually a couple. I'm sorry, you were first, and we'll come up to the boss.
Connie mentioned common interests of suburbs and counties and the city. some cities have done something to increase the amount of metropolitan government, Minneapolis, for example. And in Canada, that's happened to quite a large extent. Is there any prospect of that idea getting traction in the Chicago area?
Want to take a first step?
There's some, but they don't have any teeth. They can, there's some regional governments that are starting to form, the mayor's conference, but they can make proposals, but they don't actually have the teeth to be able to take effect.
In the name of reducing costs or something, I don't know what the word is.
Mm-hmm. And if we're going to be able to build a future, that we're going to all have to cooperate. We're going to have to cooperate on transportation issues. We're going to have to cooperate on housing issues. And there needs to be, and Dick can probably speak to this a little more than I can, but unless they're given the formal authority to be able to pass legislation, that's not going to happen. And right now we're just so fragmented. 540 taxing units within the Cook County alone, 1,200 within the metropolitan region, and nobody wants to give up their own little piece of the power.
What we end up talking about in the book is metropolitan governance rather than metropolitan government, for a simple reason: there are no metropolitan citizens.
Yeah.
No one identifies themselves as a citizen of the metropolitan region, or there are few. We've done polls in other places like St. Louis studying this. We haven't done them in Chicago yet. We might end up doing that with a new poll we're doing this spring. But there is a need, for the reasons you suggest, since everybody's out of money, it doesn't make sense to continue to do things inefficiently. That's why, for instance, Tony Preckwinkle wants to get rid of the unincorporated areas as a service zone for the county. That's why Pat Quinn wants to get rid of some of the extra school districts, because some of them have only one school but have a lot of administrators. The mosquito abatement districts in Cook County, of which there are 4 separate governments, each of which have a payroll, each of which have a governing body of more than $1 million a year. A number of them seem to find that going to Hawaii in the winter is a very good place to study mosquito abatement. They're elected. It's a travesty. They could all be under the county health department. I was talking about what they do there, besides having an elected regional council, is they allow the regional council to redistribute the new tax money which comes from establishments. So why should a place like Schaumburg be wildly rich and have low taxes when the communities next door don't get any of the revenue from the business in Schaumburg, even though they get all the traffic on their roads and so forth? It makes no sense, and you could redistribute it. Also, if you did that, you could impose restrictions. You could only give the extra money, it's extra, but it would mean taking the new money from the new commercial establishments in their sales tax and giving that only to suburbs, let's say, who do affordable housing. If they don't have affordable housing, they can't get the extra money. So you have a means of reinforcing what we know in planning would be a good thing. The Chicago 2020, they've got a new name now.
It's almost 2020.
We're
almost at 2020.
I know, they changed their name because I think they're called Metropolitan Strategies or something now. Anyway, they have proposed this. It does make sense. Any change of any significance in the governance of the region can only be made, well, in 2 ways. One main way is it has to go through the state legislature. The state legislature is the only body with authority over all of those governments. Second option, is, which Tony Preckwinkle is beginning to try, is you can do certain things through the county government that would at least make what we have more rational. I use the example of the unincorporated areas, and we could go on and on about why they're completely irrational, backwards, and stupid. But I'll leave out all the diatribe on that one.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much to Dick Simpson, Connie Mixon, and Don Rose for speaking tonight.